Welcome back to Made to Walk. Today, we're going to be talking about church safety or nonprofit association safety, I should say. This could work for any house of worship or nonprofit facility. This is the type of subject that nobody really wants to train for, but it's important for us to discuss and go over. A lot of this information you can find if you've gone through the FEMA House of Worship training as well. But we're going to dive into it just a little bit more specific the way that we do through Made to Walk. So, just a little bit of back history. In the past 10 years, there have been more than 600 acts of violence committed in houses of worship. It is really important for us to see this as a reality and not something that will never happen here or that happens in big cities or other places in the world that could never happen in my church or my nonprofit. The reality is that we just need to be prepared for them regardless. Our first point of the topic is who is a threat? Is there a perfect profile? And the answer to that question is that no, there is no perfect profile. There is not anything that I can outline as far as what this person should initially look like. However, what we do know about profiles is that there's something that do not happen spontaneously in this particular type of violence. They do take time to plan it. There's times where they will even scope out the environment or give signs or symptoms of their personality or behaviors that tip people off. It's very rare that you will ever have something like this happen and that no one will say, oh, yeah, we could have seen that or something, kind of jumped out at us about this person. There usually is something. It's just a matter of either one, people come forward and they report that information, or two, whether or not people take that information and truly take it responsibly and act on every point of information that they get. But it does have to do with a little bit of the behavioral aspects of where they are just in their environment, but also their home situation and just past traumas, prior encounters that they have gone through either with law enforcement or other factors. And so, again, there's no perfect way for you to know, just to know that they do take the time to scope out these types of facilities or they work themselves up to this kind of engagement. So it's important for us to be on high alert and to take notice and take things seriously when we do see them. There are four basic ways to look at these types of situations and understand how these types of situations develop. And the first is research. There is, again, planning and preparation that goes into this type of act of violence. And so that may very much be scoping out or creating maps of the location. The second component is the emotional component, which is a history of either being bullied, threatened, or harassed, attacked by others. And so if they are in an environment of trauma altogether, sometimes I like to think that people disregard, and this is something that is just expansive more to what we do here at Made to Walk. Sometimes people disregard the simplicities of how people handle grief, how people are handling the loss of a job, or just very drastic environmental changes where they cannot see the transition well. They think that there's no other solution to their problem. And that's what really goes into the mental aspect as well. There may be suicidal threats or attempts, difficulty, again, coping with a lot of environmental issues that you can take into consideration, divorce, academic failure, things to that regard. The interest is the fourth component here. And so that is an inappropriate interest of accounts of things like mass violence or violent themes in movies or books or video games that you can see in writing, maybe particularly notes or essays, where they just, again, are very graphic and their mind is very much in a fantasy world of where they're depicting potential possibilities of things that they could do to harm others. So now that we kind of know a little bit about the persona that goes into a person who would want to create an act of violence in a house of worship, how can we create the interior design within our nonprofit to safeguard us? And that is through crisis management planning. Obviously, this is what we do. It's our emphasis. I'll do another video as to what goes into a crisis management plan. But the three main components that you need to take into consideration in your crisis management plan, in particular about this subject matter, is planning, communication, and access. So, in the first category of planning, in many cases, the person formulated the idea for the attack at least 2 weeks in advance and planned out the incident. So again, just making sure that when you have logistics in place, so let's just say that you are running your Sunday mornings or you are having your Wednesday evenings and they're pretty routine. You like to have routine, it makes things consistent. Unfortunately, when you have too rigid of a routine, it's easy for people to understand shift changes or temporary lapses in change of cameras or change of staff and things to that regard. So it's important for you to change up the routine often. Not so often that you create chaos within your own organization, but often enough to where there's not such a line of consistency that it can be easily monitored and then mapped out. The second component is communication. In nearly every case of school attacks, the person who was told was a peer and rarely did anything to bring information to an adult's attention. In fact, in many cases, friends or fellow students actually encourage the attacker to act. So it is important in environments, especially in youth or in what we call micro ministries, where there tends to be behavioral issues in association to those ministries. Let's just say your drug and alcohol addictions, your grief loss groups. To have people who are constantly monitoring conversations that are having as well. You don't want to create an environment, obviously, where someone is just telling all the time about what they're hearing. But when you can train your volunteers to, hey, if you hear any of these keywords, if you are aware that this person is thinking in a very dangerous, dark environment, make sure that you report that to us immediately so that we can meet with the person and see if that's something that we either need to safeguard from or get them better access to particular external NGOs or therapy that can help them in association. Because our ultimate goal is obviously to help people who are in a state of crisis and to help them before they get to the point of doing something disastrous to themselves and others. But it's also important for us to not it's really simple for us to kind of look at that situation and go, well, this is not my problem. I'm not getting involved with that. Or that person seems too messy or complicated. I'm not going to engage that situation. And so we safeguard ourselves from that active crisis communication, which can really be detrimental to ourselves because then we don't get the full sense of facts that we need as well. And third component is access, awareness of purchases and access at home to weapons. So, encouraging families to be conscientious of what your kids are watching, what they have access to. There are a lot of ways to communicate online through such things as servers that are not just direct social media access. So, what most parents will tend to monitor are things like Facebook posts, you know, X or Instagram, even Snapchat. But when these conversations are happening, they're happening in chat rooms on servers that are external to anything that would be publicly posted. And they do tend to find groups of people who have common interests that really encourage them to go down that road and can help them to find the resources that they need. So paying attention to things that seem odd and off-ended when it comes to purchases as well. You see receipts for things that are in mass quantity and that just don't really make sense. Especially when it comes to things that you would typically buy at like a Home Depot or a hardware store. Definitely taking those as not something that's just random, but something to definitely lean further into. The reason why houses of worship tend to be so easily accessible and can do so much damage so quickly is because we are considered what you would call a soft target. We have this open door policy, this philosophy where we want to care and we want to love others and we want to help them in any stage of life that they're at. We want to have this very warm, welcoming love, which does make us vulnerable to people who are looking for opportunities to harm vulnerable people. The second part of that is our ideology. And when you come with an ideology that is very, very profound, you can at times get some very extreme different differentiations of thought, diversity of thought, and it can really attract that kind of impulsive behavior that comes to wanting to take out people with an opposite viewpoint than you. There can be turnover, and so when we see a lot of new faces, it can be really difficult for us to associate someone that shouldn't be there. Somebody that feels off. When you see a lot of new people come through your doors often, it can be really hard for you to see the red flags in the day to day. So knowing certain particular things to look for, or being comfortable, training your volunteers to be comfortable with things like, do we need to have people go sit in the front row of the church with a backpack? What do you need a backpack for? Like, if it's clearly in association with something necessary, like it's a diaper bag, and you can clearly see that. But there are definitely certain things that just seem off, like it's a very warm day outside and somebody's wearing a trench coat. So just noticing things that are off placed can really help you in getting the necessary information, instead of just looking at it like, I don't know if I should say anything. And then after the fact, being like, I did see something that was off and I didn't say something. Again, our predictable schedules kind of make it difficult. So changing up those schedules, the flexible access, people arrive early and leave late. So making sure that you are talking about if volunteers or staff members are the last in the building. Are they locking everything up? Are they, in a buddy system to make sure that they're never alone, and having some kind of formulated plan for when they arrive and when they leave that isn't just left to like, well, we'll just see how this goes. You really do need to think out methodically each part of that process, and you can work with a really great emergency response team. Reach out to your fire department in your local community, and they can help you to build out a simulation and a plan specifically for this type of thing. We don't actually do this type of training, but we have fantastic partners we can refer you to for doing that, where they can build out some possibilities for you to reenact and see if your system works well. Open events, when you have them open to the public, you want to make sure that you are communicating the limitations of responsibility. We've talked about that in some of our other trainings, but also you need to have very realistic barricades. So sometimes we use parking lots as a place to expand our play. Or experiences that we're offering for kids or whatnot, making sure that you have levels of barricades, always levels of barricades. So it should never just be that I can pull my car up right to where the kids are, that there are cars blocking, and that I would literally have to go through what we call the 3-layer step, when I need to go through multiple layers to actually access anyone that would be a soft target. Especially with today's day and age, unfortunately, the reality of the fact that people use vehicles as a place of harm and will plow through crowds, which just seems unrealistic. Like, it just seems so crazy. But at the same time, this is just something that you have to take into consideration in your crisis management plan. Speaking with your child care workers, again, when you're speaking, don't speak with a place of like doomsday, end of the world, crises type of feel. You want to lead with confidence, and you want to lead with information. Make them feel confident about your plan. Let them know that you're there to answer any questions, that you want them to feel supported and trained, because then they feel like they are in the right spot. A lot of times volunteers will be deterred, but the idea of like, I don't think that I could know what to do in that particular situation, it's okay. You don't have to know what to do. We've built this crisis management plan and have made it accessible for you to understand and to be trained, because we don't expect you to always know what to do. So just take away that sense of, personal responsibility. They feel like they're personally responsible to come up with a plan. Take the leadership role and make sure that you have a crisis management plan in place. So, when we talk about common motives, we talked a little bit about ideology and the differentiates. I cannot speak today. The opposites of opinion that can go into these types of conversations that can trigger people to have extreme responses to them. I like to tell people consistently, when it comes to nonprofit work, whether you're in the church or you're working specifically with victims, Stay away from anything that's subjective. It really does help with the barrier of misinformation and or misunderstanding, because sometimes we can say things with conviction and think that that clearly came across the way you meant it, with love and with intention, and sometimes what it can come off as is something completely different. And so if you steer away from subjective ideas, you tend to lean directly only into facts and truth, which makes things a little bit easier for you to be able to communicate the difference of opinions. And I can usually bring someone from like the point of, I'm so angry and irate that I just want to like flip this table, down to, okay, I see where you came from. You're not necessarily going to always change someone's viewpoint or change their mind about something, but they will at least see your point of view when you don't use things like, well, that's wrong because it's stupid, or that's just a bad argument, or those are just bad people. And so when you use these very subjective terms like, well, what do you mean by bad, or what do you mean by, it just only muddies the water. And so just keep to really clean answers that don't have any subjective verbiage in them, and really try to steer them into a space of understanding, as opposed to making them seem like they're just dumb for their viewpoint or religious view or ideology standpoint. So that does help to de-escalate if you are talking to someone specifically about ideology. The second part is external issues. So domestic disturbances and personal conflicts, things that happen outside of the home, and outside of our environment or our control in nonprofit work, can bleed into our environment when they bring it in. So they may be coming to church that day, or they're going through a divorce and someone's not letting them have access to their kids, or they've gone through an extreme emotional break. And so, out of a safety point, maybe there's just a separation going on, and that person is not answering their phone calls, and so that lack of access can really create this external issue that nobody on a staff knows about, and realistically shouldn't even really know about, but will end up at your front doors. And this has happened many times in ministry, that I've gotten to witness, essentially just like someone knocking on my parents' front door, who's like, my husband is chasing us with a shotgun right now. Can I stay here for safety? And in that moment, there's so many different variables. Like, you've now made us a soft target. Like, there's so many things to take into consideration. And so if you're not crisis management trained, it would be a really difficult situation for you to be in. Luckily, I just was around it a lot. So again, when you're dealing with crisis, it may not always be something instinctual that you can train your staff for, that's happening in real time between your people, or between something that's happening at your facility. It may be something external that comes in. So you need to be talking about those variables of, what do we do when we have a situation where we've got a couple that we know that domestic abuse or restraining orders are involved. How is our plan to navigate that? That should be in your crisis management plan as well. So I want to talk for a second about specific timing of these events. So most incidents last 20 minutes or less. Realistically, they're just a few minutes. So by the time someone even calls 911 and they arrive, many, many times the situation is already over. And so most people think that they'll have time to just call the cops. The cops will get there and they'll handle the situation. And there's nothing really for a nonprofit to train specifically about, because realistically, that's what professionals do. That's what they're trained to do. There is not enough time in these particular types of situations and incidents for that to be realistic. They're really there to almost just essentially manage the situation after the fact, or deal then there with any fallout that comes out after the fact. But most of the time, what you do in the first 5 minutes or less really changes the trajectory on how successful your plan is to safeguard the people that are within your facility. And so you want to have a few things in your and again, some of my slides can be a little bit wordy, so you can go through them at your own pace. I'm taking a very long FEMA training, and I'm trying to condense it into our typical like 30 minutes to 40 minutes of our training. But um, I'm just going to hit some of the main points of this. So, you want to assess the situation and choose the appropriate responses and take immediate action. So, you want to take action to protect yourself first so then you can turn and protect others. It's the same situation as if you were on a plane. Put the mask on first, mom, before going to the kids. You need to be able to address, where is our crisis management plan? How do I get to it? A lot of times, and we'll talk about this here in a minute, it is, you have two particular go bags, one on each side of the building, and in there you have particular things. It's important that if you have members on church volunteer teams or staff teams that are safety teams, that in that go bag are some kind of neon vest that they can put on to essentially show that they are someone that is holding a weapon but is not the perpetrator, because when police officers arrive, they're not going to know who the threat is and isn't. So that's really important that if you have a safety team, that they have communicated and are consistently updating and communicating with local law enforcement as to what their strategy is and what their crisis management plan is, and to make sure that those two parties can communicate and are cohesive, because the last thing that you want is the wrong person getting hurt when the police officers arrive. So making sure that you communicate what that is. You want to I'm skipping over a couple things here. So, initiate the chosen response action and related emergency protocols found in your plan. So, again, these things should already be gone over in your hypothetical and worked out. Again, you can work with your local law enforcement to develop this strategy, but you need to have essentially a response plan that is initially from point 1 minute to point 20 minutes, when you essentially hand over control of the investigation part of it and the control aspect of it. But a lot of times, they're not going to be able to control the things that you can control, such as being able to lock down certain parameters of the building if you have a locking system, communicate through intercoms or text messages systems to your volunteers or your leaders in particular rooms, letting them know what's happening in real time. Those kinds of things are things that you can manage that law enforcement is not capable of managing. They just don't have the access to it. So those are things for you to practice and to have in place and to be able to communicate and train properly on, that have nothing to do with law enforcement. So don't, in other words, just to summarize this entire slide, as don't assume that your crisis management plan is to wait to call 911 and have them take over. There are things that you can do to train and to put into place between minute 1 and minute 20 before you hand over control. So someone is always going to ask me, what are some red flags, Izzy? How can we know if someone is truly a threat without just initially profiling? And so there are obvious things that kind of stand out. Um, but then there are a few that you might just miss. And so I want to go over a few on this list. And if you can see my slide, obviously you can see a variety of them. But things that really pop out for me are people that sit in their vehicles for extended lengths of time but don't come in. That really throws me. And we've seen this before, where people will like send their kids in for youth, but they don't actually go into church themselves. And so sometimes it is just a typical routine. This person just does this, but it's not a common average behavior. So definitely learn to have informative conversations with people. Never just assume like, oh, that's odd, but move on with your day. You want to learn how to have confrontational but safe conversations with people, like, hi, is there anything that we can do for you? Did you want to come inside? Asking questions that don't seem intrusive, like, why are you here and why are you in this parking lot? Because again, for safety reasons, you don't want to create anything that can bring harm to yourself, but also you do need to ask viable questions that safeguard your community. Walking or running up to the door and looking around as though they're on the lookout. So if they seem very skittish, you want to keep that in mind. taking unidentifiable items out of the vehicle. So if you have someone that's monitoring your surveillance cameras, you know, send someone out to go and investigate that. Walking awkwardly as though they're concealing weapons. So if someone that you've seen before who didn't have a limp all of a sudden has a limp or something to that regard, um, that can typically mean that they have more on them that they're able to bend their knee or to, move their arms directly with. And so, again, red flag. Obviously trying to go unnoticed or looking for concealment, carrying or wearing, particular bags such as backpacks, wearing unusually inappropriate clothes. We talked about this here a second ago. If it's really bulky, but the weather is not conducive for bulky clothes. Going into areas other than the sanctuary when no one else is present, and especially when they're hanging out in environments that they don't have a reason to. So if they keep going by like the children's ministry check-in, but they don't have kids, take that into consideration. Your head should always be on a pivot. That's just even for me, I'm not on a security team. My head's always on a pivot. I'm always paying attention to like, what is that bag? Where is that person? Where are the exits? What is going on in this particular situation that could be off this week from last week? Not so much to the point where it becomes obsessive and distracted from your actual worship, but just enough for you to understand what the normality of a situation is and when something seems off. That's what you really need to know is when you understand the baseline, like we talk about the baseline of behaviors and people, there are baselines and routines of how an average day goes, and when something doesn't feel right or when something is off. Um, Someone could be standing very still when everyone else is moving forward, displaying unusual emotions like rage or nervousness or fear, like they're just sweating for no reason. Um, and again, they could be trying to move closer and closer to the stage or trying to get in a position that has a particularly good angle for something. So just think strategically. If you're on a house of worship security team, you're thinking strategically. If you're just someone who's a volunteer and you are particularly involved with a nonprofit, then again, just take consideration into what is an average day, and is this, are all of the motions that are happening around me conducive to an average day? So I will get asked, Izzy, what are the four first things or 4 or 5 first things that we should put into a plan when talking about this without it being overwhelming like a fire hose of information? And it can really just honestly be boiled down to these 4 points that are in the female plan: what to do, when and where to do it, who is responsible for and what their individual roles are, and how to communicate with others. So again, it does nothing to say, well, someone will hit the emergency button that will lock all the doors. Who is the someone? And what happens if that someone is sick that day or nowhere near the button? Who is the second, in the chain of command who can have access to that? You need to go through each of the roles and responsibilities and create a very real person to handle those responsibilities, not just like in a perfect world, we would have someone do this. Have a very real person, even if it's a volunteer, who manages that, and then a backup person for the very off chance that they are not there, and maybe even a third backup person. Okay, so you really need to have a plan for your plan for your plan in an ideal world. In the worst case scenario, you have a take cover management. So maybe you have not run through the simulation. You can at least adapt to these 3 main points. You want to evacuate when you can, if you can. Okay, not all situations will allow you to evacuate, but if there is a part of the building that you can evacuate, do so. Have an escape route and plan in mind. Leave your belongings behind and keep your hands visible, because again, it's very important that we let law enforcement know who is safe to be exiting and entering. Hide out. If you cannot evacuate, then you are hiding out. You hide in areas out of any type of shooter's view, block the entry to the hiding place and lock the doors, silence your cell phones, and or they still have pagers on here. I don't think many people have pagers anymore, but essentially any other formulation of technology, your Apple Watches, your tablets, anything else that can ring the alarm, you want to make sure that you silence all technology if you can. I know most people will want to try to leave them on for forms of communication, but it's important for you to, at minimum, silence them. And then the third option, if that barricade is taken advantage of, is to take action as a last resort, and only when your life is in imminent danger, you would take action against a shooter and attempt to incapacitate the shooter. And so oftentimes they will practice taking basic resources around the room that can be used as a weapon. It could be as simple as a stapler or a bookshelf, book holder, anything that could be heavy or used as a weapon, and formulating a plan to use that to bring down someone that comes or enters the room. Your safety standards should include the basic necessities of these five key points: partnerships, process, people, pacing, and plans. Partnerships is essentially laying a foundation with those partners that we talked about, your law enforcement, your fire department, whoever else that you're bringing in to formulate a plan that is successful. Don't just depend on yourself alone. There are many people out there, your emergency response coordinators, who will happily sit down, look over your plans, and make suggestions. There are external organizations that come in and consult for that as well, and we can help you to get connected to one. Your process is to commit to the process. So essentially to train, to understand how it's implemented fully, that it is not just a stack of paper that you hope someone grabs on the day of an incident and has time to read, 164 pages. These are things that you are constantly taking into consideration to properly train and to prioritize. People involve the right people, making sure that your staff, that your volunteers, that anybody else that needs access to the training has that. Pace yourself for success. So in other words, don't do fire hose right off the bat. Don't think that you have to have like the world-class, best organized crisis management plan to ever be delivered in real time. Start with a first step. What can we start with to minimize threat? Can we increase our barriers? Can we increase our front door security? Do we need to change up our schedules or our plans? And then start to move to the next part and to the next part. Don't feel overwhelmed by it, because then you'll just tap out. You'll leave it alone. It'll look like something daunting you never want to touch again. Each one of your crisis management meetings, you can develop it a little bit further, a little bit further. Maybe you meet quarterly and you talk about, as an organization, whether it be with your staff or your board members or your executive team, that these are things that you want to tweak or implement. And get reports. Like, is our plan working? Are there things we can be doing better? Everybody's facility is very unique. And so there are always opportunities to make tweaks and to retrain for new environments. Again, talking about the who is safeguarding, who is present, who is likely to answer in particular situations. Like, who do we call when something bad happens? It's outside of 911, like who's the first to know? Um, these are things that you talk about specifically to your lower level teams. So you may have trained as a staff, and that's great. You may have trained as an executive committee, and that's great. And you may even have a security team, and that's great. But if the lowest level greeter or hospitality volunteer does not know who to tell what to, or who to report what to, or what to do in a particular situation, who would even handle that, your plan is for nothing. Because in particular situations that are most important, and I want you to really honestly hear this, when people like us go in and we train specifically to things that you want to look at as far as behavior, personality traits, as far as the fundamental baselines and understanding what a common day response is, We're not going to walk into an airport and talk to the pilots. The pilots are not going to see the people. You would talk to the janitors. The janitors are spending the most time on the lower level around people who think that nobody is paying attention to anything going on. Those are the people that you want to talk to. You want to talk to the lowest level employees who are doing the most with the actual people that are going to be able to see something and report something before it even becomes a threat. So we really need you to understand how vitally important it is to have this conversation, not just at the top, but all the way down to your volunteers, and then customize your plan. I'm going to take a second here to just briefly kind of show you the customized layers of security that I mentioned here a moment ago, where you want to see those levels of security kind of placed as far as your first layer, your second layer, and your third layer. Your first layer should be natural or constructed barriers, usually at the property line or sidewalk. The second layer should be from your property line to the building, and the third layer should be your building exterior or interior. So essentially, there should also be layers entering the building for safeguard as well. Offenders had easy access into the facilities in most of these constructed, um, post-mortem reviews of situations. When we look at what things went wrong, it was just too easy to get into the building. Occupants had inadequate escape paths. So again, clearing and always making sure that not only that you have these barriers to get through into your place of worship, but also that you have clear paths out and that you understand what those clear paths are to get out. Staff or volunteers were unable to spot threats in time. So, again, trading all the way down your volunteer list. Staff were not trained and empowered to take independent life saving actions under the extreme stress of the actual incident. So, knowing what to do when it comes to emergency care, which is a completely different training that I w- probably won't get into, but might we'll circle back around to it. And then communication was inadequate. So I've said this in pretty much every training, but you can never over communicate when you are in a particular situation. I just said this in a training that I just recently did with emergency responders. Communicate, and then communicate, over communicate. There's no such thing. No one is ever going to say I received too much information. They're going to say didn't I wasn't CC'd on that. I wasn't aware of that. Why wasn't that brought to my attention? How did we know about this and we didn't do anything about it? Who was this reported to? Why didn't it get back to me? There's always a broken line of communication. So learn to fix your lines of communication. Here are a few modern tools in closing that you can really help to clean up your systems and help the proper information to go out. So, your push notifications, voice notifications, or email notifications, especially for understanding if anyone is checked in or on the grounds versus someone who's not checked in or not on the grounds. When law enforcement arrives, we want to learn these simple things: put items down, raise your hands, and spread your fingers. Keep hands visible at all times. Avoid making quick movements toward officers. Just some basic essential housekeeping. You never step behind an officer, you never step to the side of their gun. And these are just basic mistakes that can happen. So, again, helping volunteers to learn how to be able to communicate whoever they're responsible over during that time. Avoid pointing, screaming, or yelling. In moments of extreme pressure that can be very difficult to control, know the difference between freaking out on someone who's freaking out and learning how to talk people down from a point of extreme pressure. One of the easiest ways to do that is to mirror response. And so instead of looking over to someone and telling them to essentially shut it, you're going to get us all killed, looking at them and saying, I know that you are feeling so scared and overwhelmed. I feel the same that you're feeling. I want you to know I'm going to be right here through this process with you. If you need to hold my hand, if you need to whatever, you come down to their level and you help them to feel like they can step a little bit back from fight or flight. I will do an additional training as to behaviors more associated to the trauma of fight or flight, because one thing that does or can happen that most people don't take into consideration is when people freeze and they actually shut down. They're nonverbal. It's almost like you can see them leave their body through their eyes. It's almost like an out of body experience. They currently cannot really move or associate to the situation. How do you handle people who are frozen in fight or flight? All of those types of behaviors can be really difficult. We do them in extensive training. Again, I'm taking a very long training and I'm condensing it. These are natural behaviors that happen with people. The most important part of the process of training church volunteers is not to know what to do with every particular situation like they're an expert in their field, like we are. It is about helping them to understand that everybody reacts to trauma differently. And the most important thing is that you are present, that you are calm, and that you guide them through the process. You don't shame them. You don't argue with them. You don't belittle them. You don't leave them behind. That you find ways to first console yourself so that you are not in fight or flight and also fleeing and leaving your team behind, which can be a thing, but you are practicing to reel in your own emotions. So if ever placed in that situation, you can, so that you are putting your mask on before going over to somebody else and you are helping them to console and to bring that into a space until you can get them the proper medical care. Professionals will be able to take it from there. I have talked on this before. I will continue to make a point of it in my videos. There's a 6-month period between the point of trauma and when psychological damage tends to show itself to be permanent or a severe issue, and that's at the 6-month mark. So we have 6 months to get them into the right care where they are seeing for counseling or some type of talk therapy or other types of therapy to handle their trauma. But in that particular moment, your job is not to fix them or to make them get over the situation. Your job is simply to find ways to stay calm yourself so that they feel confident in you in that particular situation and they too can stay calm. What points of um, implementation can we take into our plan further? What is the action? Who is responsible for the action? When should the action take place? How long should the action take? And how much time is actually available? What has to happen before? What happens after? What resources are needed to perform the action? These are things that you put into your strategy plan. When to evacuate, when to reverse evacuate, which is a process of you cannot. How do you go from being in a big open space into a closed doored room? Um, and then when and how to clear a room, how to room clear if you are helping to evacuate the building and you're moving people from one room at a time out into the open. These are all things that happen in an actual training. And the reason I kind of throw them here at the end is because I want you to understand this is not the end all be all to your training. I want you to just get familiar. You should almost at the end of this training feel like, ooh, okay, like we have not discussed any of this. We need to truly implement a more realistic plan. Maybe you have some formulation of a plan, but it's not thorough enough. Maybe you've just started on the basic essentials of what you might need, just like surveillance cameras or barriers. And that's good. Again, don't feel overwhelmed like a fire hydrant. But this is also to show you that whatever you're doing, you can always train harder. You can always implement more strategical ways to safeguard your nonprofit. I am not going to go over everything that should be in your emergency kit because it's just way too much. But it's here on this list. And I want you to understand two major things. One, there should always be two kits, and they should be on opposite ends of the building, accessible and understood by staff members where to receive those kits. In there should be a clipboard or a binder with your emergency operation plan, quick referencing guides to the emergency procedures, reunification plan, which is something that you work on if you have children separate from adults, how to get children back to their parents, to what point do they get back to their parents, because law enforcement will tend to keep them safeguarded and separate for a time, especially if there is any kind of negative part of the situation where you have to identify who didn't get out or anything to that regard. So there's a more extensive part to the reunification that, again, you need to be working with law enforcement with. Your evacuation sites, if you are moving people from one location to another, and a copy of the most recent security assessment. You want to have your site plan information, including your maps and photos, your building floor map. So if people need to understand, are there other ways for us to get out of this building? Are there other places for us to go? Bus routes and driver contact information, lists and contact information. So for emergency responders, do you have direct contacts to people that you can reach out to? List of all occupants, including staff, students, or congregants and volunteers, identification of persons with access or functional needs, and a description of the needs, attendance, if you can get to it. Some of those things are more mobile now, which is great. If you have a tablet that you can have in there that has access to who checked in, who was in the building, who was in each of the classes, a current photo series. Again, most of these things are digital now. They're usually in your check-in system, so you can know who is supposed to be in the building and who wasn't in your personnel directory, as far as who's a staff member and should have been in the building. Then there are many different types of things in here for rescue and response, things like a rescue whistle and so on and so forth, your first aid kit, things that you can have in your classroom, your nursery, and other areas as far as supplies. Again, you can go through all of this in the FEMA training that's a little bit more extensive, or you can really work with your law enforcement to come in and do a hypothetical assessment, as well as a training with your particular building and understanding what your particular building needs, because your environment is going to be different than somebody else's. Even if you are the church down the street, you cannot copy, you cannot rinse and repeat the same plan. Your building, your people, your environment, everything about it is very unique to you, and you need to be working on a strategy very unique to you. So what to do after a threat? Communicate, communicate, communicate. I can tell you that for sure. You need to be very, very, very clean and in control about who is responding to media, who is responding to law enforcement, who is responding to parents. And the narrative and the conversation needs to be cohesive. Every point of information needs to be as clean and cohesive as possible. It should constantly be running through your communications commander, if you have one. Hopefully you do. At very least, if you have an incident commander who can say, this is how we are going to respond, this is what we are going to say until we have more information, this is the only response that we are saying. And you need to limit that. Staff members will be tempted to tell family members and friends things separate from, like, hey, nobody knows this, but you need to really emphasize that that is something that is just not acceptable in this particular situation, because it can create a lot of fear, liability, and a lot of other issues. Know how and where people will be cared for, protected from further injury and emotional trauma. So we do not want people to rush to a situation who are untrained to be talking to parents or be talking to people who are already scared themselves and be saying things that can be very intrusive, invasive, the wrong thing to say. That's why we train, retrain about how to handle these situations, what to say in these particular situations, and what not to say in these particular situations. Please, please protect and safeguard those environments to where not anybody can just come in and give false information, create more chaos. They might just be there to take pictures and to post on social media. And so, again, just limit the access. Have a process to safely release people. Um, Develop templates in advance of incidents with prepared statements so that general information can be released quickly. I highly, highly recommend this. Even if you are a very, very small staff, it is very easy to say the wrong thing at the wrong time. And so if you create templates where we say, this is the standard template, and then we will customize it, particularly date, or particular title of the incident, you can implement those. But you should have those strategically in place for anything, any type of event that you have. Some people will argue that that's like putting negative possibilities out there in the atmosphere. I tend to think of it as more being a proactive action to safeguard people and to protect their emotional state as much as their sanity, because for us to be emotional and then try to think of a strategic response that does not onset somebody when we are in a state of crisis is more difficult. But when you're not there mentally and you can just think of it from an atypical standpoint and just say, this is hypothetically in the best case scenario of what we could say, let's say this, it's going to be more controlled to know that you have that in place and you're not trying to think of the right words to say in that immediate moment of time, especially when your team members and your staff might be emotionally affected by the situation than themselves. Agree with partners to coordinate messages and to speak as one voice. We talked about that just simple, in simplest form. Establish a schedule for the release of information and briefings. So understand how often you want to be able to be accessible. Otherwise, you'll get people who are just hounding you consistently. For the release of information and briefings, write a letter to families and loved ones the first day after the incident about the incident, any memorials or available support. Issue updates as more information becomes available. Consider using a website to share updated information. Provide a tip sheet for families, caregivers, loved ones on how to provide support. This also needs to extend to secondary support. So a lot of people associate trauma to only people who were there at the particular situation. But in reality, those people's families and their extended family, their friends, their coworkers, anyone that knows them and, was scared for them or thinks, what if that happens here? Anybody that has extended secondary trauma from an incident should also be receiving care. They're also within that 6-month ratio. They can build anxiety disorders, dissociation disorders. They can create phobias where they just don't want to come out into public, don't want to associate or assimilate anymore because of the hypothetical possibilities of things that could go wrong. So we want to make sure that we understand that we are communicating all aspects of being able to treat trauma, not just the initial response, which is what I often see NGOs do. They are phenomenal at being there for the first few weeks and to create resources like food and clothing and care and prayer and all those things. But then when the hoopla dies down, when the media goes home, it tends to fade off. And really, honestly, what I have experienced is when that tapers off, at the 3-month mark, at about 90 days, when everyone kind of goes about their life and they've moved on, except for the people who have actually experienced the trauma, that is actually when they need it the most. And so that tends to be when I like to show up. I like to be there way after the situation has occurred, because then I can actually see how much trauma is left over and where we are in a standstill, because you'll often find people almost like in a zombie-like state where they don't know what to do next. They're so overwhelmed by the emptiness because it was like adrenaline, 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 and then gone. And so we can help them to formulate ways to take a one step at a time, to develop ways to be able to come back to houses of worship or to experience positive atmospheres one step at a time, and be patient, but be loving and caring on them so that they don't fall into a deeper and deeper and deeper state of psychosis, whatever that psychosis may be. I hope that you are learning something from this process and that it is not just overwhelming you and making you feel fear. That's never my intention. It's always my intention that we walk away more educated and informed so that we can implement more environments that feel safe for people to attend and be a part of. This is an unfortunate part of our reality, and it's something that we have to discuss, but it's not something that we have to walk in blindly. There are lots of resources at your hands, including local law enforcement who would love to work with you on that. Made to Walk will help you to build those partnerships and connections and to help you to develop a crisis management plan specifically for your organization. So we'd love to work with you on that. And thirdly, working with, nonprofits to develop partnerships as well. And you can always go to FEMA online and take some of their online free courses specifically to House of Worship, and that will help you to be certified and assessed in that particular field. So I hope that we have learned to walk through this particular crisis more clearly together, and have a great rest of your day.